Thanks so much for being here. Welcome, faculty, staff, and students. Thank you for joining us for the 13th annual Paul Lyons Memorial Lecture. Our guest today, Donald Iacovone, will be of great interest to this intellectual community at Stockton. His subject is one of vital importance to current and emerging teachers, educators, policymakers, citizens, and parents of New Jersey and beyond. Before we welcome Dr. Iacovone, I want to first thank my colleagues in American Studies and all the people who helped bring this event to you, including our events and production services friends, our security and catering details, our deans and staff in arts and humanities and in general studies, our graduate studies team, and the many individuals who played small but important roles in putting this event together. Our event is named for Paul Lyons and is funded partially through the Paul Lyons Memorial Foundation, established by Paul's wife, Mary Hardwick, and named and carried on in his honor. Paul was among the founders of the American Studies graduate program, of which I'm proud to serve as chair, and our program reflects, I think, Paul's vision of interdisciplinary public engagement with the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Today, the Master of Arts program in American Studies is connected to dual degree undergraduate options in 6 majors from 2 academic schools, and our contributing faculty extend well beyond these programs. Paul, I am sure, would be happy to see the seeds he helped plant grow in this way. I've had the privilege of memorializing Paul Lyons at prior Lyons lectures. I had been familiar with his work on the Vietnam War before I came to Stockton, and I was honored and delighted to take over a general studies course he instituted here called the 1960s. But tonight, I asked Pat Reed Merritt, Paul's friend and colleague in the social work program, who worked alongside Paul and knew him, to lead us in his remembrance. Dr. Pat Reed Merritt is a professor of social work and Africana studies, and she will help us remember Paul and other faculty members we've lost recently. Pat.
Thank you. Music. This is not a sad kind of music. This is a sort of inspirational, happy kind of music, because that's the kind of person that Paul was. And for those of us who knew Paul well, he was also a musician. And so he would be happy that we're playing this kind of music as we talk about how important it is for us to remember Paul, not just Paul, but others who are associated with Stockton, with the program in American Studies, as well as those who've had a commitment to social justice. Paul, as was indicated earlier, was a member of the social work program, but became very involved in American Studies. And like so many others, Paul believed in an interdisciplinary approach to education, and Stockton became the beneficiary of those efforts and initiatives. Paul died suddenly in 2009, and I can say it was probably one of the first events that truly shook up our campus. Paul was such an active energy. No one was prepared when we got the news that Paul had died unexpectedly. And almost immediately, people wanted to do something to commemorate his life, but also to keep his memory alive. And that's how this lecture series came about. And that was indicated earlier again, this is the 13th anniversary of this particular lecture series. And we always identify an individual that's going to help us better understand what it means to have a commitment to social justice and social change. And you're going to hear from that person later on today. Paul, maybe he was lucky because he was the first to leave us. And as the first, was the one that we named this series after. But as some of you may know, this last 6 months in particular have been very difficult and challenging for our faculty here because we suddenly lost other important contributors to Stockton University. Just 2 years ago, in the midst of the pandemic, though, we lost Professor Dr. Joseph Walsh. Now, he was a professor of philosophy and religion. And like so many others, Joe was very much committed to helping to elevate an understanding of what it meant to be committed to a program of social justice and social change. Joe was active around the campus, very energetic, involved in so many, many things. And one of the things that he was most proud of, even though he made many contributions to Stockton, but he and I joined together and came up with the idea that we should name the new events room at the Atlantic City campus in honor of Fannie Lou Hamer. And if you're a Stockton person, you understand who Fannie Lou Hamer is. We have been celebrating the history and the legacy of Fannie Lou Hamer for the last 20 years or so. And so sometime in the middle of the night, Joe, gave me a call and said, don't you think we should do this? And of course I said, it's a great idea. And that room was named after Fannie Lou Hamer, and it was really Joe who first came up with the idea. And it was so important to him and his family when Joe recently passed, less than 2 years ago. That's what they included in his obituary. Said Joe was proud of the fact that he was the one that brought the idea to the campus that we should have a room, an events room, named after Fannie Lou Hamer. If you've been on campus in this last, certainly in this last, 6 months or so, you know that we also lost Professor Bill Daly. Bill Daly, some people may have called him Mr. Stockton. He was so involved in everything that Stockton was about. He was very, very committed to building the program. He was one of the original faculty members here at Stockton and was very much involved in the general studies program. Bill Daly devoted his entire life to teaching, committed to elevating every student that could be elevated to help them achieve their highest goals. Bill was so committed to Stockton, and people so admired his commitment, his involvement in the interdisciplinary approach we have here. Just recently, following his passing, they decided to rename the School of General Studies the William T. Daly School of General Studies. He too, like the others that I talked about, was committed to a philosophy of social change and social justice. How are we gonna make things better for the world? At the same time, a week or so apart, a couple weeks apart, we lost Dr. Elizabeth Betty Elmore. Betty was in the economics program, also in the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences. Betty was committed to economic literacy for everybody. She directed the program that we have here at Stockton. And like so many others involved in interdisciplinary initiatives, she was committed to the program we have in gerontology. She was committed to programs in Sobel that talked about ways in which we could increase awareness of particular needs around gender, sexuality, and so on and so forth. And she too wanted to be involved in an institution where they talked on an ongoing basis about the need for us to be aware that we had to be actively engaged in the fight for freedom and social justice. We all are just not quite over the fact that in the last few weeks, we lost Dr. Ann Pomeroy. Ann came to us a little later. Some people described her as one of the mid-career kinds of faculty members. She began her service at Stockton maybe about 24, 25 years ago. Ann was in the philosophy department, but she also contributed very heavily and strongly supported the program in Africana Studies. Ann taught us that there was such a thing as African American philosophy. Her course was extremely popular. Students often write about how it was one of the most transformative courses that they had taken. Ann, like Paul and all the others, had a commitment to social justice. And like Paul, in fact, Ann and Paul were quite close. She was a musician as well. And so they spent their early years here with the Stockton Band. And within that bonding of being both a musician, an artist, a scholar, people who had an active need to say we're going to do something about bringing things to a greater awareness in regards to issues regarding equality and so on and so forth, that Ann became involved in all of the things that she could be involved in Stockton. And so American Studies which has collected faculty from all over the schools. We want to pay tribute to these individuals who are no longer with us, but their spirit is here, and they certainly have inspired us to do greater things. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. I was honored to know Anne and Joe Walsh very well. I unfortunately didn't know our other late faculty members, but I understand they all knew each other, and we're here tonight in their honor. Tonight we continue the scholarly, social, and educative mission of our predecessors by introducing Donald Iacovone. Dr. Iacovone is a lifetime fellow at the Hutchins Center for African and African American History at Harvard University. He was the 2013 recipient of the W.E.B. Du Bois Medal, Harvard's highest honor in the field of African American studies. He won an NAACP Image Award in 2014 with Henry Louis Gates Jr. for his work on the PBS docuseries, The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. And this year, he's been nominated for an LA Times Book Prize in History for his work teaching white supremacy, which you can see up here, as well as on the QR codes on this slide and outside, if you're interested in purchasing the book. Teaching White Supremacy looks at well over a century of American history textbooks and what they taught about race and slavery to generations of American students. His talk addresses directly the role of history courses and other kinds of courses in teaching Americans about the role of race in the national past. Today, we are seeing an assault on efforts to remember and teach about the legacies of race in America, from anti-CRT legislation proposed in a majority of US states, including New Jersey, to book bans and gag orders not limited to racial history, but also to the history and presence and accomplishments of LGBTQ, indigenous, immigrant, and other marginalized peoples and groups. What is clear is that what young people learn about America, how they learn about it, and where they learn about it plays a huge role in determining our conceptions of nation, citizenship, and belonging. And we should pay careful attention to how that is done, past and present. I'm honored and privileged to introduce to you Dr. Donald Iacovone.
Green, we'll switch it back, and then a red goes back.
Backwards, okay.
Yeah, so let's just give it a test.
All right.
Yep. Sure. All set.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for coming. This is quite an honor for me to be invited to present here at this wonderful campus with fabulous faculty. I've got quite a tour so far, and I'm deeply impressed by what I've seen. I'm lucky to be here, and I think the students are lucky to be here as well. There is I think a personal link in a way, to Professor Lyons. My book is very much like the first books that came out in the field of American studies, like Henry Nash Smith's Virgin Land, books from the 50s and 1960s that looked at central features of American society to try to capture the essence of the American experience. And I think this book does it. It also, in the course of doing it, I learned the truth of something that the famous, or rather legendary, Wisconsin-born historian Frederick Jackson Turner had said back in 1891. He said that, quote, "Today is so much a product of yesterday that yesterday can only be understood as it is explained by today. For the present is simply the developing past, and the past, the undeveloped present." My work on this book taught me the terrific and profound wisdom of that analysis of Professor Turner, because what I'm looking at explains so much about our current social crisis that is ripping at the seams of American society. The 1619 Project's Nicole Hannah-Jones recalled that, and these are her words, "The world revealed to me through my education was a white one. People of African descent did not matter. She had been taught that they were," and these are her words again, "inconsequential at best, invisible at worst. If they appeared at all in her textbooks," she remembered, "it was only as slaves and disappeared until the rise of Martin Luther King Jr. We were not actors, but acted upon," she observed. "We were not contributors, just recipients. White people enslaved us, white people freed us." The great writer and social critic, James Baldwin, recalled in 1965 that he had been taught in American history textbooks that Africa had no history and neither had I. I was a savage about whom the least said, the better, who had been saved by Europe and who had been brought to America. After class, the young Baldwin thought, "Of course, this was an act of God. You belonged where white people put you." 160 years of struggle against this fabricated version of national identity had begun to bear fruit when, in 2016, the delayed response came, and with a fury. As the New Yorker writer and Harvard professor Jill Lepore wrote, "It was as if Barack Obama's election in 2008 had, quote, ripped a tear in the fabric of time. What he symbolized could not be tolerated. Accepted understanding of what constituted true American identity was at stake. The tear in the fabric of time had to be erased." As if affirming Newton's third law of physics, that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, national politics responded with the election of the great white demagogue. Anxious whites had risen up in 2016 to elect a figure who would re-empower them, even if only symbolically. White men in America believed that their voice wasn't being heard. Vanderbilt University professor of sociology and medicine, Jonathan Metzl, observed, "Trump gave them their voice back." In the fall of 2016, as the former president of the Organization of American Historians, Earl Lewis, related, the prospect of a Donald Trump victory had inspired those whites suffering from a perceived sense of lost dignity, status, and respect with new hope. They saw in him a revival of white supremacy and black subordination. Trump would, as one white New Yorker informed an African-American woman who grabbed the last seat on a subway car, put people like her, quote, back in the effing fields. Effing fields. What the congressional investigation labeled seditious conspiracy of January 6, 2021, aimed not at just denying the election of Joe Biden, but to prevent what many of the participants asserted was a coming white genocide. Disturbed whites feared that what they damned as the Great Replacement theory, a conspiracy of liberals and minorities to replace white people with immigrants of color. As early as 2018, a University of Virginia poll had discovered that 1/3 of white Americans believed that they must defend the nation's white European heritage. The astounding attack on the U.S. Capitol with its gallows erected outside embodied what Jill Lepore called a race riot, a white race riot. As Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin recorded in his recent memoir, a significant minority of Americans, quote, refused to accept the end of white supremacy. And in mobilizing political, these are his words, political lies and racial grievances to resist any fulfillment of what we would call cultural democracy. What analysts have denounced as the big lie, Raskin rightly equated to the lost, quote, lost cause mythology of the post-Reconstruction era, which aimed to defeat equal rights for African Americans and give the South the victory in peace which it had lost in war. James Baldwin's observation of 1963 remain as true now as in his own lifetime. Such Americans are, he said, in effect still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. Creating such an understanding, then or now, is the challenge. But Baldwin did identify the central issue at stake in our ongoing American crisis. The danger, he wrote, in the minds of most white Americans is, quote, the loss of their identity, unquote. They understand this as an assault as, quote, one's own reality. This is exactly what motivates those like the 19-year-old white supremacist that murdered 10 African Americans in a Buffalo supermarket last year. As the Boston Globe reported, the white adolescent had become obsessed with preserving, quote, white power in the U.S. And it always has been so. In 1895, the prominent New England poet and editor Thomas Bailey Aldrich had become unsettled by the flood of immigrants he saw on the nation's streets, their, quote, accents of menace alien to our air. He cried out in one of his poems, "O liberty, white goddess, is it well to leave the gates unguarded?" Aldrich's fear of what he saw as alien people taking over American cities reflected the central role that Northerners played in the forging of national identity. As much as Americans wish to deny it, the past matters, and the legacy of how we have defined national identity is a crisis ripping at the nation's seams. According to one recent Associated Press poll, at least 32% of Americans believe that some of their fellow citizens, quote, are trying to replace native-born Americans with immigrants. The Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Bernard DeVoto observed back in 1943 that Americans, quote, have always devoutly believed that the superiority of their institutions, the government, the mode of life would eventually spread by inspiration and imitation to less fortunate and less happy people. The American destiny to spread our free and admirable institutions by action as well as example by occupying territory was captured by the 1843 phrase, manifest destiny. This 1873 lithograph, variously entitled Manifest Destiny or American Progress by the New York publisher and Western travel promoter George A. Crofert, exalts the divine mission of the United States to expand across the continent that Bernard DeVoto had described. The illustration's alluring figure of Columbia with the Star of Empire on her forehead floats across the landscape, sweeping away indigenous peoples and the wilderness for the expansion of American farms, cities, and railroads. Her left hand clutches the telegraph line, the internet of the 19th century. And her right cradles not the Bible, not a digest of laws, but as Crowfoot wrote, quote, the emblem of education, the school book. You can't see it. It actually says school book on the cover. Never before or since has any American more graphically unified national identity with white supremacy and education. It illustrates the cherished past that is rapidly becoming unhinged. I did not set out to write Teaching White Supremacy. I had been deep in research for a different book, but my encounter with the astounding collection of about 3,000 history textbooks at the Harvard Graduate School of Education's Monroe C. Gutman Library compelled me, forced me to change, threw me into the unknown. The unexpected result is not a book about a bunch of bad books, but an exploration of the origins, development, and perpetuation of the idea of national identity as white from the colonial period to the present. If nothing else, it focuses on the responsibility of Northern cultural leaders and educators for the creation and dissemination of white supremacy and construction of the color line. Traditionally, both scholarship and popular thought have blamed the legacy of Southern slavery for the distressing persistence of racial inequality. And of course, Southern slave owners and their descendants do possess a unique and lethal responsibility for civil war and racial oppression. But even if slaves had never existed in the South, Northern religious leaders, intellectuals, writers, politicians, scientists, educators, and lawyers would have invented a lesser race, which is exactly what happened, to build white democratic solidarity and in that way make democratic culture and political institutions possible. As the novelist Toni Morrison once explained, in the United States, the rights of man, quote, was inevitably yoked to Africanism. In other words, American democracy depended upon black inequality to sustain white equality. Responsibility for this consciousness of exclusion, this enduring identity of true Americans as only descendants of white Europeans, rests broadly and profoundly in our history. The principles of white supremacy have been central to the American experience, predating creation of the American Republic, and whatever commitment to democratic republicanism that later emerged. Samuel Sewall, you may remember, is the 17th century judge of the Salem witchcraft trials, expressed the essence of how later white Americans would come to understand American identity. Ignoring all evidence to the contrary, early American settlers and their descendants conceived of their new communities as special, divinely inspired creations of Europeans for Europeans. The people of African descent who lived and moved among them, not even considering the Native American residents, especially in New England, would always be outsiders, foreign objects, no matter how respected, even admired some people of African descent might be, as Sewall noted in his own diary. They would always remain separate, distinct, outside the mainstream of American life. Sewall, who in 1700 crafted the Selling of Joseph, the nation's first anti-slavery pamphlet, had denounced slavery as an unchristian scourge and reminded New Englanders that, quote, he hath made of one blood all nations of men. Yet, Sewall also explained that African Americans, quote, still remain in our body politic as a kind of extravasant blood. They existed outside the regular veins and capillaries of the body politic. The African presence raised such fearsome concerns for Sewall that it made him wonder if he would retain his cherished whiteness, quote, and these are his words, after the resurrection. This assertion of a people who exist outside of American identity, beyond white consciousness, set the pattern that would remain with us to this day. The Reverend Henry M. Field, brother of the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Stephen J. Field, who helped decide the landmark 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case that nationalized Jim Crow segregation, had been born in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Field, like Samuel Sewall, embodies the way Americans have created national identity. The so-called color line, he explained in 1890, is not peculiar to one section of the country. These are his words. It exists at the North as well as the South. It would be a mistake, he warned, to ascribe what we call race prejudice to the peculiar perversity of our Southern brethren. Although Reverend Field had been raised by the formerly enslaved Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mombette, who had initiated a landmark legal case to win her own freedom and help end slavery in Massachusetts, he felt powerless to reject racism. Such sentiments, he held, quote, were a matter of instinct, which is often wiser than reason. We cannot fight against instinct, he explained, nor legislate against it. If we do, we shall find it stronger than our resolutions and our laws. In the mid to late 19th century, few people possessed the power, determination, and influence of John H. Vannevery. Ha, worked. The nation's first professional racist and the embodiment of the white supremacist foundations of American democracy. As the spindle upon which the pre- and post-Civil War eras swirled, he worked feverishly to permanently bind white supremacy to the nation's democratic ethos. The North's most belligerent enemy of Reconstruction, Vannevery employed his unprecedented genius for marketing to inject white supremacist ideals into American political discourse, North and South. Moreover, immediately after the war, Vannevery and his business partner, Rushmore G. Horton, sought to shape public consciousness of the past with their raucous history textbook, A Youth's History of the Great Civil War in the United States. They used it to repudiate the policies of the Lincoln administration, reject all political and social equality for African Americans, and to guarantee that future generations would always cherish white supremacy as the nation's governing principle. And their textbook, which was used in Boston, influenced lost cause advocates of the South. The influential head of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, Mildred Lucy Rutherford, quite a character, you could read about her, reprinted Vannevery's book and employed its conclusions to defend the South, secession, and slavery. And it remains a staple on white supremacist websites. Smart, ambitious, and blessed with boundless energy, Vannevery fused an unprecedented marketing campaign to an exhaustive command of the work of ethnologists like Harvard University's Louis Agassiz to bolster the white supremacist foundations of the Democratic Party and the white working class. Best known for his repellent books, Negroes and Negro Slavery, Free Negroism, Subjugation, a word he made up, and White Supremacy and Negro Subordination. These were published from the mid-1850s through 1867. Vannevery also ran a small publishing empire, Vannevery Horton and Company, in the heart of Manhattan. as it turns out, just a few blocks from the National Anti-Slavery Standard. In addition to his textbook, Van Every's firm circulated a flood, and I mean a flood of pamphlets, texts, even a novel. And he also published 2 newspapers, the Day Book, which was rechristened the Weekly Caucasian in 1861 after the Lincoln administration tried to shut down papers that promoted disloyalty and treason, and another one, the Old Guard, a monthly journal, devoted to the principles of 1776 and 1787. You can see where he's going with that. Van Every, who popularized the terms white supremacy and master race, had been either overlooked or grossly underestimated by most modern historians and remains unknown to the wider public. A toxic combination of Joseph Goebbels, Steve Bannon, and Rupert Murdoch, Van Every too often has been dismissed as unimportant. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nearly all Democrats of the mid-19th century knew him. Abraham Lincoln had read some of his works. Even Europeans knew of Van Every's publications. Moreover, his ideas resounded in the U.S. Congress. New York Representative James Brooks, a Queens Democrat born in Maine, recited Van Every's toxic ideas in December 1867, quoting at length the New York publisher's defense, quote, of white man's government, and what he labeled as the gross incapacities of African Americans. Even a Wisconsin state representative read Van Every's works to his fellow legislators, and he asserted that they were, quote, the embodiment of my views. There remains, Representative Mitchell Stever declared in 1858, quote, a perfect harmony with the facts that the Caucasian race is peculiarly progressive, while the Negro is this moment what he was 4,000 years ago. We have undervalued Van Every's impact, ignored his poisonous writings, and failed to understand how much he helped shape modern white supremacist ideology, even in the South. His venomous views played an enormous role in the assault on what we now consider to be our modern understanding of liberty and civil rights, and struggled to emerge after the Civil War. By ignoring him, we have completely underestimated the intensity of Northern white supremacy before and after the Civil War. Nearly all the textbooks I read, and I cite 250 in the book, had no connection to any kind of Southern segregationist press, and certainly not to the Klan or any other far-right publisher, although those emerged during the 1920s and remain online. No, the thousands of textbooks that have stained the minds of generations of students from the elementary grades to college were produced almost entirely by Northern publishing houses situated mostly in Boston, New York, and Chicago, and crafted by Northern-trained scholars, people like me, and educators and education specialists. Indeed, several of the most famous and influential American historians of the first half of the 20th century, nearly all trained at Northern colleges and universities, produced some of the most racist texts I had the displeasure to read. The process of crafting this book also took a rather unexpected turn. At the Gutman Library, where I did most of the research, much to my own astonishment, I found the 1962 textbook Exploring the New World, which had been assigned in my 5th grade social studies class in Saratoga, California. Reprinted repeatedly between 1953 and 1965, this textbook had been adopted by schools around the United States, and I checked. As I opened its still crisp white pages, my gasp must have jolted those marvelous librarians working near me. It all came rushing back. Somehow I had never forgotten the book's image of Eli Whitney included in the book not because of his notorious cotton gin, but instead for allegedly inventing, quote, inventing the concept of interchangeable parts, thus laying the groundwork for industrialization. The book never mentioned the anti-slavery movement, just like all the textbooks published before the Civil War. Slaves, on the other hand, proved necessary to pick cotton. Who else would do the work? These authors, and there were 3 of them, asked. At the same time, however, the textbook did note that people of the North did not believe that men and women, quote, should be bought and sold. But exploring the New World followed the same pattern set at the close of the 19th century, a nation seeking reconciliation regarding issues related to slavery and the Civil War. Its authors also wished to avoid cultural strife and the reality of slavery and racism, and promote national unity amidst the Cold War in the 1960s, by asserting that during the Civil War, everyone was brave, everyone fought for principle, everyone white, of course, and that General Robert E. Lee represented all that is noble, gallant, and heroic in American society. His name, they wrote, is now loved and respected in both North and South. We know that he was not only a gallant Southern hero, but a great American. Such textbooks compelled me to rethink the trajectory of American history and culture. And for most of them, there was nothing subtle about the approach. Not subtle. One 1930 textbook I saw had on the very first page at the top, in booming capital letters, the story of the white man. Only English-speaking people created America history text taught students. As one 1918 textbook proclaimed, the forces that have shaped that life have been English. We possessed a fixed identity, the book asserted, one inherited exclusively from Great Britain. Well, Ralph Waldo Emerson had been worshiping that view in his 1856 book, English Traits, merging physiognomy, morals, and ethics as only Emerson could do. Race, he wrote, was the controlling influence. And in the Negro, he wrote, it is, quote, of appalling importance. He disdained slavery, but bemoaned the common moral failings of a white person more than anything else. Certainly far more than the, again, his words, captivity of 1,000 Negroes, which is nothing to me. Emerson. Another school book, A Child's History of the United States, insisted that early U.S. history was the record of the white man's progress over the godless red savage. Slavery and African Americans had no place in that 1856 textbook. Across 2 centuries, and with precious few exceptions, African Americans in these textbooks appeared, if they appeared at all, as only a problem, only as, quote, ignorant Negroes, unquote, as slaves, not people, and as anonymous abstractions that only pose, quote, problems for the real subjects of these books, people of European descent. As one 1914 school book typically asserted, the black man, quote, became a problem that it took many years to solve, unquote. The assumption of white identity, white domination, and white importance underlie every chapter and every theme of the thousands of textbooks that blanketed the schools of our country. This vast tectonic plate still underlies American culture and must be a central concern for every single one of us. And while the very worst features of our textbook legacy may have ended, the themes, facts, and attitudes of supremacist ideologies are deeply embedded in our national identity, in what we teach, in what we read. Even our youngest students, if Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is any evidence, become indoctrinated in such principles when they first start to read. Such has always been the case. Noah Webster of dictionary fame, 1832 History of the United States, proved distressingly typical of U.S. history textbooks published before the Civil War. Webster cared nothing about the history of slavery or African Americans. Recalling Baldwin's opening words, "I would remark," Webster wrote elsewhere, not in the book, quote, "that of the woolly-haired Africans who constitute the principal part of the inhabitants of Africa, there is no history, and there can be none. That race has remained in he wrote, has remained in barbarism from the first ages of the world. Their country has never been fully explored by civilized man." For Webster, Puritans, especially Connecticut Puritans, were the country's founding fathers. His book made only passing mention of the settlements below Mason-Dixon and completely ignored the rise of slavery. American history, for Webster, was the record of his Puritan forebears and no others. Thus, for the next 2 centuries, the standard of whiteness in history had been set. Much to my astonishment, no American history textbook before 1860 ever mentioned the name of an abolitionist or even acknowledged the existence of an anti-slavery movement or movements. Given how the Compromise of 1850 rocked the country and bonded abolitionism to free speech and basic constitutional rights, this fact astounded me. If slavery was mentioned at all, and it was, but it was mentioned only in discussions about Congress and political leaders like Henry Clay. History for this generation of textbook authors took place, and this was a model that persisted into the 20th century. European exploration, colonization, revolution, the Constitution forming, party politics, and then each successive presidential administration, with every paragraph numbered. From a reader's perspective, this approach proved onerous and at times really oppressive. William Swinton's 1872 First Lessons in Our Country's History, aiming to combine simplicity with sense, clearly proved intolerable to one reader who stabbed the copy I read from the back right halfway through the book. A few texts could be innovative, like Thomas Howland Munford's 1856, The Child's First History, which turned out to be a breezy colloquy between a little girl named Madge, her sister Anne, and their aunt. Their fanciful discussions with no actual history focused on Native Americans and never mentioned a word about slavery or African Americans. The Connecticut-born Samuel Griswold Goodrich, who gained fame, international fame, as Peter Parley, claimed to have published 170 different books selling 7 million copies. His enormously popular Pictorial History of the United States, originally published in 1843, sold 500,000 copies. The 1866 edition, which came out after his death, simply tacked on a new chapter about the Civil War to the original edition, but somehow failed to mention that slavery had ended. His brother, Charles A. Goodrich, he had been a Protestant minister, and because his brother did so well selling textbooks, he gave up the priesthood and started writing textbooks. His book followed this usual visual format with each paragraph numbered and all that. And while it did disapprove of the institution of slavery, it never mentioned any abolitionists except John Brown, who he said was crazy. The book lacked any coherent discussion of even the beginning, the last edition, the beginning of Reconstruction. Thus the message to students, Black lives do not matter. There are, of course, important exceptions to this pattern of white supremacy that appeared after the Civil War. They were shaped by the war, shaped by the abolitionist movement, and of course by radical Reconstruction. But most textbooks that appeared after the 1880s and for most of the 20th century proved far more disappointing and more overtly white supremacist than those that I had read that were published before the Civil War. Even authors offering sympathetic views of the abolitionists and even treating John Brown respectfully revealed their deep, deep prejudices when dealing with the history of Reconstruction. Inevitably, the worst chapter in almost every single textbook I read that was published before the mid-1960s. Most rendering of Reconstruction parroted this toxic group of scholars, Claude Bowers, George Fort Milton, James Truslow Adams, and especially Columbia University professor William A. Dunning. A whole school of interpretation of Reconstruction was named for Dunning. And Dunning, more than anyone, succeeded in having the country understand and define Reconstruction as, quote, a synonym for bad government. He and other Northern scholars made sure that Americans understood Reconstruction as a period in which, and these are his words, Negroes exercised an influence in political affairs out of all relation to their intelligence or property, even proportion to their numbers. Nauseatingly and relentlessly, these texts repeated the phrase ignorant Negroes to describe the free people who struggled to find a future amid the embattled landscape and inevitable and intractable resistance of Southern whites. Indeed, reading our textbook history of Reconstruction from about 1900 to the mid-1960s is a shocking immersion in historical distortion, white arrogance, and racial domination, black incapacity, and nostalgia for the sweet old days of slavery. How sweet? Arthur C. Perry and Gertrude A. Price, their 1914 two-volume, let me repeat that, two-volume American History Grammar School textbook explained the life of slaves by employing this color image of gleeful Negroes at the cabin door after a day's work, getting together for a rollicking time. They presented slavery as a kind of summer camp, and they're not alone. Almost all of them did. Where people of African descent, quote, lived careless, easygoing lives. They were childlike people with no sense of responsibility. From the little pickaninnies to the oldest old aunties and mammies. The authors wrote that slaves lived contented lives and, quote, were better off than they would have been if left to shift for themselves. Typical of the pattern, Perry and Price were New Yorkers, not Southerners. The latter a PhD superintendent of schools and the former a New York City public school teacher. Fremont P. Worth's The Development of America, good, included this image of, quote, ecstatic slaves. And I should tell you that when I gave a similar lecture at Harvard last year, I had a teacher come up to me who taught in Florida and said that he was compelled to use a book that had an image similar to this one. The Illinois-born Worth had received his PhD from the University of Chicago and became a famous professor at the Peabody College for Teachers in Nashville. And his book, which came out first in 1937, was reprinted throughout the 1950s. Even segregated black schools in the South were forced to use it. Similarly, Thomas Marshall's 1930 textbook, the one with the capitalized letters in the beginning, it was reprinted throughout the 1950s. And he riveted in the reader's mind Van Every's notion that people of African descent were best suited and thrived in the Southern labor system, overseen by what he called the kindest of masters. The Negro of plantation days, he wrote, was usually happy. He was fond of the company of others and liked to sing and dance and crack jokes. You can see them. And laugh. He admired the slave, admired bright colors and was proud to wear a red or white or yellow bandana. He was never in a hurry and was always ready to let things go until the morrow. Most of the planters learned that not the whip, but loyalty based upon pride, kindness, and rewards brought the best results. Textbooks certainly were written by Southerners, and the first one may have appeared in 1850, and much later, others appeared authored by women. But if a Southern school district wished to avoid possible influence of Yankeeism, they could assign one of many published state histories. In South Carolina, there were a couple that were available. John E. Chapman, Social History of South Carolina, Henry Alexander White's The Making of South Carolina, which came out in 1906. Or a state history that was written by at the time, famous Southern novelist William Gilmore Simms. His book first came out, his History of South Carolina, first came out in 1840. And it was used continuously through 1937, revised and expanded by his granddaughter. It was published in New York. And why not? As Northern presses had resources and distribution networks that few Southern presses that existed had. Chapman, who I mentioned earlier, had followed in the wake of Van Every and depicted the introduction of African slavery in Western Hemisphere, quote, as an act of humanity to relieve Native Americans of work, especially in Southern mines, South American mines. The appropriately named White made sure that students understood that in South Carolina, Negroes worked the rice fields because they could labor without injury to themselves and whites could not. Moreover, he wrote, without these workers, there could be no Carolina rice. He rarely employed the term slave, and much like Texas textbooks until 2019, he preferred the term African or Negro laborers. Modern baby boomers, my generation, who lived in Virginia or in the suburbs of the nation's capital, likely saw very few U.S. history textbooks and instead received their high school history lessons from the 1957 book, Virginia, History, Government, and Geography. And it was guaranteed to conform to white standards by the state's, quote, History and Government Textbook Commission. That volume closely followed Jim Crow and Van Every versions of slavery and the past. Slavery, the book's three authors asserted, proved a great benefit for whites, but a godsend for African Americans. An illiterate people who, quote, knew nothing of Christianity or civilization and learned both as slaves and adapted easily to Virginia work and climate. In this way, the authors wrote, Negroes played an important part of the development of Virginia. Just as John H. Van Every had asserted, this textbook described Negroes, quote, as the best answer to the need for labor in the Tidewater. The slave trade, which did enrich Yankees, represented no great burden. They arrived, the book said, in specially designed ships with, quote, many little cubby holes or cells to stay in during their long voyage. They never mentioned the 2.5 million Africans who died in the horrific Middle Passage. Nope. Their labors in Virginia did not hurt them, they wrote. And they benefited enormously from enslavement by learning trades and enjoyed the work and play of the plantations. In his new home, the Negro was far away from spears and war clubs of enemy tribes. And he had better food, a better house, you can see them in there, and better medical care than he did in Africa. And he was comforted by a religion of love and mercy. They held up George Washington as the standard of Virginia's slave masters. He offered his human property, they wrote, quote, sweetened tea, broths, and sometimes a little wine. Moreover, masters proved wise. They never harshly punished slaves and only occasionally whipped them, but the same way an adult would whip a disobedient child. It's the way they describe it. But the most damaging volumes were written by Northerners. Gertrude and John Southworth, two Indiana teachers, one a junior college professor and the other a prep school teacher, published The Story of Our America. They spoke openly about our America, leaving absolutely no question about whom they referred. The text adopted by the state of Indiana for the 7th and 8th grades built upon decades of scholarship which scorned Reconstruction. The Southworths used this image in their textbook. This came directly from D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, Birth of a Nation. And they used it to illustrate how the Klan and similar groups heroically defeated corrupt carpetbag and scalawag governments and their Negro tools to restore respectable whites to their justly dominant position. And this book came out in 1950. An author's gender, like Northern birth, made absolutely no difference in the ways race and Reconstruction appeared in school books. Helen F. Giles, a teacher in New York City's Horace Mann Elementary School, affiliated with Columbia University, crafted a 6th grade U.S. history textbook that encapsulated all the worst qualities of Reconstruction historiography and offered it just for the young. After the war, she began, the South lay prostrate. She plagiarized James Shepard Pike's vile 1874 history of Reconstruction in South Carolina. Their buildings were destroyed, farms were ruined, rail lines were torn up, and worst of all, young women were dressed in black. Those are her words. While whites suffered so terribly, freed slaves roamed the countryside believing that, quote, they would never have to work again, unquote. Instead, they stole and plundered, she said. In just 1 week, she asserted, they were one town arrested 150 Negroes for thieving. Even worse, she said, they were, quote, very insulting to white people. With Yankees in control, Southern governments became corrupt, filled with Yankee carpetbaggers and, quote, ignorant Negroes, mostly black or brown, some of the type rarely seen outside the Congo. Mingling with the Negroes, we see the ferret-faced carpetbagger eager for spoils. Northerner wrote that. Few could match the popularity of or the damage done by the University of California's John D. Hicks. He dominated the system's Berkeley campus from the 1940s into the 1960s. In his enormously popular history classes, he taught students that anything beyond vocational training for African Americans was a waste of time. That's in his textbook. He mocked the African Americans', quote, pathetic eagerness for education, asserting that they showed, no, quote, no great proficiency beyond the elementary stages. His 1943 textbook, A Short History of American Democracy, which was used in colleges and high schools, described slavery as, quote, by and large, a distinct advance over the lot that would have befallen him, that is the slave, had he remained in Africa. Besides, Hicks remarked, where else could a people so untutored enjoy picnics, barbecues, singing and dancing? Slave religion, he said, was, quote, extremely picturesque, and their moral standards sufficiently latitudinarian to meet the needs of a really primitive people. Heaven to the Negro, he wrote, was a place of rest from all labor, the fitting reward for a servant who obeyed his master and loved the Lord. Cohabitation without marriage was regarded as perfectly normal, and a certain amount of promiscuity was taken for granted. These are his words. Slave women rarely resisted the advances of white men, as their numerous mulatto progeny abundantly attested. At its website, the University of California, Berkeley, recalls Hicks' enormous influence, classes with over 500 students, and what they wrote as the impossibility of estimating the number of students whose knowledge of American history had been built on Hicks's histories, but it is certainly an immense number. Tragic. That such rabid fiction could pass for history in the 1940s or at any other time remains, at least to me, shocking. But this kind of textbook history continued to influence generation after generation of students, ignoring the counter-narratives that came out during these same years by scholars like John Wesley Cromwell, George Washington Williams, Carter G. Woodson, and of course, W.E.B. Du Bois. Not until the 1960s did a new generation of black and white scholars just begin to transform our understanding of the past and the African-American place in it. But even with profound changes in scholarly understanding of the past and the central role of African Americans in the creation of the American Republic, as the Southern Poverty Law Center has shown, even when textbooks are inclusive, far too often teachers refuse to teach it. The influential New York Times journalist Charles Blow, who was born in 1970, that's for me yesterday, explained that when he was young, quote, I was led to believe blackness was inferior. We had been trained in it, bathed in it, acculturated to hate ourselves. At every turn, at every moment, I was being baptized in the narrative that everything white was right, good, noble, and beautiful, and everything black was not. The bitter influence lay everywhere, even, he wrote, in, quote, the blue-eyed white Jesus hanging over your bed. The experience of black high school students in my own community outside of Boston 3 years ago reinforced Blow's own account. A local branch of the NAACP, along with students, protested school, this was at the high school, school curriculum and punishments handed out to black pupils. I am not going to lie, one young woman exclaimed. Going to high school made me hate being black. Despite 60 years of dedicated modern scholarship, the long, heroic civil rights movement, and endless social and political commentary, in too many painful ways, little has changed since the African-American scholar Charles Wesley surveyed history school curriculum in 1925. The black student, he wrote, is made to, quote, realize that his badge of color in America is a sign of subjugation, inferiority, and contempt. Just in the last few years, in classrooms in Vermont, New York, New Jersey, Ohio, Virginia, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Florida, black students have been compelled to stand in front of their white classmates as slaves to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Such, quote, curricular violence, as one Vermont parent wailed, is hardly unique. In Watertown, New York, the teacher of a 4th grade class ordered a black boy and girl to stand in front of their white classmates with their hands behind their backs. Just as in slave times, they said. And the winning bidder would be their master. The teacher announced that if the slaves tried to escape, they would be chased down and violence done to them. An investigation of the incident afterwards revealed, quote, lasting emotional harm to those 2 students, no doubt. When a similar event took place in an Ohio 5th grade class, one mother objected. She was told, this activity, this is the quote, this activity was part of the state's required curriculum. Too bad. In Florida, now the center of cultural censorship and the strangulation of academic freedom, a teacher assured his students that the N-word quote, just means ignorant. Minnesota 5th graders in a lesson plan right out of the 1920s learned that African Americans regretted the end of slavery because, quote, the enslavers took care of them and gave them food and clothing. This is 1925. This is like yesterday. In Rhode Island, students received absolutely no exposure to the history of slavery until high school, and even then, it was 1 paragraph. In Oregon, a teacher advised a group of biracial students who had acted up at lunch that, quote, you're lucky I'm not making you pick cotton and clean my house. A Texas school teacher advised his students that if the South had won the Civil War, all the black students in class would now be slaves. Until 2019, Texas textbooks described slaves as, quote, imported workers, as I had alluded to earlier, and that secession, not slavery, caused the Civil War. More recently, Texas and Florida have banned about 800 books related to slavery, race, sexuality, abortion, and a host of related issues, including the work of Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who I used to work for. In 2020, the New York Times reported that the medical students and residents at a Duke University survey remain convinced that African Americans have thicker skin and less sensitive nerve endings. The same vile garbage that Harvard's biologist and ethnologist Louis Agassiz spewed across the United States in the 19th century. Shockingly, if you can still be shocked, Amy Wax, a law school professor at the University of Pennsylvania, recently declared that, quote, on average, blacks have lower cognitive ability than whites. She even advised a black law school student that the only reason she could get into an Ivy League school was because of, quote, affirmative action, unquote. And if such people like Wax continue in American education, that statement will be distressingly true. In May 2019, when a large group of African American 7th graders visited the Boston Museum of Art, staff informed them that in the museum, before they got to tour the museum, they informed them that they could have no food, no water, and no watermelon. Black subordination and white privilege remain burning legacies of what we have been teaching our students. Despite the monumental outburst of thoughtful and determined scholarship since the mid-1960s, the way we teach in history in the public schools remains as lifeless as John Brown's body. But clearly, slavery and race, as the Ohio University scholar Hassan Kwame Jeffries observed, history isn't in the past, it's in the headlines. However taught in schools, history is far from a dead thing. We carry it with us, James Baldwin memorably remarked in his essay, The White Man's Guilt. We are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, he wrote, since it is to history that we owe our frame of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. Thank you. I think we have time for questions.
This one's on.
Thank you everybody for coming tonight, and thank you, Dr. Iacovone. We have some time for questions and answers. My graduate assistant, Daniel Tidcombe, and another American Studies graduate student, Alexa, will bring the microphone around if anyone has questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Iacovone, for a really interesting lecture. I'm actually a student of Eric Foner's, and he was the inaugural Paul Lyons lecturer. When he came here in 2010, he had just written The Story of American Freedom, which he then developed into his textbook, Give Me Liberty, which is actually a textbook that I use in my Intro to U.S. History classes.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah.
So for those who may not know, Eric Foner is best known for his work on Reconstruction and debunking the William Dunning School that you described that talks about government as having been so bad at the time shortly after the Civil War. So I have two questions for you. My first question is, because I'm imagining that students who have heard your lecture are going to take away from this that textbooks are bad and racist. So because I know that's the way that students often kind of think in that kind of way. So I'm curious about what your takeaway is. Do you think that all textbooks are racist? How do you think that we can teach in anti-racist ways? And I have one more part, if I can just add it to it, which is. You alluded to the writing that has scholarship that's happened since the 1960s that has tried for so long to debunk these myths with Eric Foner and his students among those.
Sure.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the resistance to that scholarship and why it hasn't made it more into our classrooms. Thank you so much.
Oh, sure. I did continue looking at textbooks. Actually, some of the better ones I read came out of the 1970s, the mid to late 1970s, and I did read Eric's book, which is quite terrific. There are other ones. The statements and descriptions that I gave of some of the older textbooks, for instance, this, unless it's an example of how bad things could be, aren't part of the curriculum. However, as I indicated, during the lecture, one teacher who I talked with had to use a book with one of those ecstatic slaves, this fictionalized cartoon version of history. So there are issues. There are additional issues. Ever since the pandemic, there have always been students who the law allows to be instructed at home, homeschooling. Unfortunately, as little we may wonder about the control that we have in modern schools, but at home, there's no control. And analysts have determined that many of the worst books imaginable are being used for homeschooling. And because of the wonders of the internet, you can pull out anything published before 1925, almost anything free online. And they're using, like Peter Parley, I had mentioned during the lecture. But as far as of the modern textbooks that I saw, I didn't have anywhere near the kind of issues that I discovered prior to 1970. But also part of the problem isn't necessarily what's in the textbook, but what isn't in the textbook. Because if it isn't there, it's not important. That's the lesson that students would learn. So if African American history is presented only as slavery, resistance to slavery, and Martin Luther King, you lose the essential role that African Americans have played in the creation of American culture. If it's not there, it doesn't exist and it can't be important. That's the lesson that subconsciously students learn. And as Charles Blow indicated, even African American students would be taught that. As James Baldwin had said, that's what he learned, and that was more direct during his lifetime. But now, if you don't teach it, you're telling the student that it's not important. And sorry, the second part of the question.
The second part was why do you think there's been such resistance to new scholarship?
Yeah, resistance. Well, I mean, what I've been describing is the way Americans have defined themselves and their nation. We are at a stage in our history in which people of European descent are becoming a smaller and smaller percentage of the populace. We don't have, we meaning the white European descendants, don't have the dominance that they used to have. And their numbers literally are shrinking. There's no question about this. It's a fact, it's a reality. And they're scared out of their minds, or at least a percentage. What percentage? 30, 40%, depends on who's doing the polling. We are looking at a profound questioning of who we are, who we have been, and who we should be. We should be in an intense discussion. We should not be murdering people, especially children, over these issues. But this is what we're at. And it is a psychic crisis of profound importance, like I've never seen in my lifetime. I don't know where it's going. I'm good about writing about the past, not so good about the future. But it is clearly a struggle that is going to continue. In fact, when I sent this manuscript of this book to my publisher 2 years ago, they were in no hurry. Why? Because nothing's going to change. It's going to be the same situation 1 year from now or 2 years from now. It'll be just as relevant. That's sad, but she was right.
Thank you for the talk, Professor, or
Oh,
Doctor, sorry.
Gotcha.
Yeah, sorry, forced to happen. Anyways, what I wanted to know is, during your archival work, did you come across any text that gave a broader or deeper explanation of the history of slavery within the United States?
yeah.
And if not,
Yep.
is there any reason to believe that such texts might exist but were not preserved in that particular archive?
No. I didn't focus on those because you'd walk out if I had to go on any longer. But after the Civil War, the era of Reconstruction, through the 1880s, and in a few cases, a few textbooks continued to be used into the early 20th century, did a marvelous job at depicting the black past, the American past, very inclusive, radical in many ways. I mean, it included pictures of Frederick Douglass. Good God, that had never occurred before. Yes, there was, and this matches with Eric Foner's understanding of Reconstruction, and it was those ideals that emerged, what historians have been calling the second founding, is clearly represented in a number of textbooks, some of them written by former abolitionists and former commanders of black troops during the Civil War, like Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Charles Carlton Coffin was the North's most famous Civil War reporter, and he wrote an enormous textbook, series of textbooks really, after the Civil War, which were terribly important, terribly well written, amazing compared to what else had been available. There were 40 copies of all his books at the Boston Public Library. All of them were checked out during his lifetime. All of them, constantly. Yes, there was a manifestation of a more reasoned, a more inclusive historiography in terms of school books after Reconstruction. As I indicated, some lasted into the 20th century, but they're just overwhelmed by the tidal wave of the stuff that I was describing. Yeah,
Thank you.
sure.
I just wanted to say, if you stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes, we're having a reception next door with some fine foods for everybody. I feel like some people are getting up and leaving and missing the chance. We're going to open the buffet after the conclusion of Q&A. But thank you.
He's got one here.
Hello, Mr. Yakabone.
Hi.
I just want to ask the question.
Sure.
Me being an African American woman, I felt like for years, like I haven't been taught like the things that I'm learning now in college about the things that we should know about myself and other African American in history books. When was the point in your life where you said you had to relearn and unlearn some of the things that you had learned in textbooks?
Well, that's no one's asked me that one yet. That's a good one. You know, it's a long, gradual process. I did not grow up in a white supremacist family, so I never heard the kinds of discussions that often took place. In the book, bear with me a second, oh, here it is. Yeah, I keep forgetting his name. I cite a book by the Harvard psychologist Gordon Allport, The Nature of Prejudice, which came out in 1954. It's right, hang with me, you'll see what the point of this is, okay? And he was writing about you know, how prejudice operated, where it came from, and et cetera, and its various attributes. And somehow during his research for the book, he interviewed a number of people. And I don't know how, he didn't say how, but he got, as a subject of interview, a 5-year-old white girl, I think from Pennsylvania, but I'm not sure. She wasn't from the South. Anyway, so I assume they asked her the same questions they were asking their other subjects, and she was crying. This is a white girl. She was crying, and they kind of taken aback. Well, why is she crying? And she was crying because there was the only black family in town was leaving, and that just floored them. She was crying because it's 1950, probably 1953, 52, 53. And they were astounded. So they asked her, well, why are you crying? She said, well, now there will be no one in town that I'm better than. That's the nature of prejudice in the United States. I never experienced any of that. In fact, when I was young, I was an avid baseball player, and I had two friends. Never actually told anyone this story. I had two friends who I loved playing baseball with, and one of them, he had the sweetest swing on the planet, just like Ken Griffey Jr. Well, it wasn't until, and I moved away, and I don't know what happened to them. I didn't realize at the time they were African American. I mean, if I looked at them now, I would say, well, of course, what do you think? But it never occurred to me to even ask that question. They're just kids like any other kid. So I didn't grow up that way, and I didn't have to overcome anything. Now, in terms of the textbook that I had gotten in the 5th grade, I don't know, for some reason, the ugliness of that presentation didn't stick with me, although the image of Eli Whitney did. I don't know why. It just stuck in my head. I never forgot it. So as I progressed in my own education, I didn't have to overcome anything. And so I learned, I was open to, I didn't have racial prejudice embedded in me, and I was open to, other interpretations. And then when I went to graduate school, my dissertation was on an abolitionist. So, and then I worked for the Black Abolitionist Papers Project for about 6 years. So this became part of me. And I didn't have any barriers to overcome. I just had to figure out what the right questions were to ask to do the research. And in this case, I got lucky. It just all happened by happenstance, and I tried to make the most of it. So, yeah. But unfortunately, most of us aren't in that situation, or a lot of us aren't. Another question? Oh.
We got at least 3 more questions.
3 more? Okay, sure.
We'll take those 3, and I think we'll wrap it up at that point.
Yep.
Is this on?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Textbooks are such an interesting thing to talk about because in the spirit of Betty Elmore, our late colleague in economics, so much of what happens with textbooks in this country is based on the economics of distribution and who gets to decide.
Yeah.
The state that gets to decide on what is in American history textbooks is the state of Texas. And the board, the statewide board that decides on the textbooks that are used are not professional historians. They are not, yea, even professional educators. They're just elected to this statewide board. Let me just give you an example of the influence of the state of Texas, this huge big state that's also influencing states all over because of the number of textbooks that Texas buys, and then that influences the producers, the publishers to produce more and more. For example, American Heritage. American Heritage Dictionary had the distinction of being the first popular dictionary in the United States. In 1979, it was the first one that contained those words that one begins with an F, the other begins with a C. You know what I mean, right? So they appear. However, there is a red-covered edition of the American Heritage Dictionary in 1979, which you can get in the rest of the country, that says the F or the C word. There is a green-covered copy of the American Heritage Dictionary that you can get in Texas and other influenced type things. So just the power of that state in influencing what gets into our schools. So what I'm trying to say is that it really matters who gets to make decisions.
Yeah.
Who is on your local school board? Who in your high school is making curricular decisions? We can be having these spiritual conversions about what we think about race. But the textbooks that our children get to see are not what we necessarily decide upon. Right? It's people that we have to pay attention, not only to local elections, but also to what is being published and why it's being published.
Well, it
And the
isn't
speech.
just textbooks. It's teacher training. We have so many teachers now have fled the profession that some states are hiring individuals to teach in classrooms who've never been to college. Yeah. And it is a long-standing tradition going back at least 50 years, probably 60 or 70, maybe even longer, in which history classes are given to gym coaches to teach. This happens countless times. And I cite some of these examples in the book. There was one high school, I think, like a dozen of the teachers who were responsible for teaching history were all gym coaches. No one would ever think of having a gym coach teach physics or biology, but somehow history doesn't matter. Anyone can do that. Anyone can't do it. And teacher training is central, and they're not getting it. I don't know. It's so complicated and so discouraging, at least for me.
I didn't even see you there. Dr. Jacobon, thank you so much for a really well put together lecture. I really enjoyed that. I do have a question for you.
Yeah.
I come from a background of archaeology, history, anthropology, and it's always been my observation that history is cyclical. Everything happens in a cycle between 80 and 100 years.
Yeah.
From my perspective, it seems like we're repeating a cycle from the late 19th, early 20th century.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that assessment? And if so, where along that cycle are we? And
Yeah.
where are we headed?
No, it's a really good question. When I was doing chapter 6 in the 1920s, I was astonished at the evidence that was coming, and it's not just about, there's a lot of stuff there that has nothing to do with textbooks, but I was astonished by the reaction to immigration, which is the same thing we are seeing today, duplicate. In fact, when I was writing it, I suddenly had to stop. So what am I writing about? Am I writing about yesterday or the 1920s? There was no difference. So, you know, cyclical or not, but similar problems produce similar results, especially when you're talking about the creation and perpetuation of national identity. So you're going to get it, and we're getting it. Yeah. You've had a question for
No,
an hour.
I feel like in some ways it's been answered, but maybe, so we have a cycle. We have an idea that we know where the problem lies. The question I have is, how does this inspire us to action, right? So we're all going to be in a position of power later on.
Yep.
And how can we, even now as students, be proactive and disruptive and try and find a way to break this cycle?
Well, first of all, having the commitment to do so is essential, number one. Boy, I know when, when I was a resistant, we went out in the streets and caused trouble. I'm not sure that's the appropriate response for this issue. And I honestly, I don't think there's a single answer. But writing books like this might help. Giving lectures like this might help. Trying to get out into the public is difficult. Let me give you an example. A colleague who read my book wanted to bring me to his college in outside of Springfield, Massachusetts. And he consulted with some of his colleagues, and they were all enthusiastic. We want to do it. Then the dean found out. Oh, no. I have to read this book first. There's clearly fear about confronting these issues, whether it's fear of the actual subject matter or fear of the response they might get. I mean, my agent even told me, you got to be careful, someone's going to shoot you. I don't think so, but that's the level of concern that is being raised by some people. In fact, when Skip Gates read the manuscript for this, first things out of his mouth was, they're going to come after you. Well, they haven't, and I hope they don't, but that's where we're at. And I think that schools, great schools like Stockton, that have students taking courses that confront these issues is essential.
To your point that that's where we're at, in some ways that's where we've always been.
Yep.
So it's a struggle for me,
Yep.
to see, I guess I was naive. I really thought it was going to be different at some point, and it's not.
Well, I didn't think,
And now I'm realizing it's even deeper than I knew.
yes, I didn't think Trump was going to win either. Yeah. Boy, was I wrong. I was well informed by the misinformed. People didn't understand the nature of the crisis we were facing. And it is one, it is profound. I mean, when you're dealing with national identity, it doesn't get any deeper than that. And we have to find a way out. Yep, I'm with you.
Thank you. We have one final question. I know Summer Hill is one of our graduate students, and he's been waiting. I was worried earlier that we wouldn't have enough food. Now I'm worried that if we keep trickling out of here, we'll have too much food. So if you do have to leave, please feel free to begin the buffet, and we'll open it as soon as we conclude. Summer.
Great. Good evening, Dr. Iacovone. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for coming to Stockton. I hope we have made you feel welcome.
You sure have.
That's great. That's great. I feel compelled to ask a question on behalf of African American men who aren't present and haven't had a voice in this conversation. I did watch the presentation that you did at Harvard, similar to this, and enjoyed the banter that you and Professor Gates,
Yes.
trying to figure out, well, what's the solution? What do we
Right.
do?
Yeah, no, good
Oh,
point.
my God.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point.
And I screamed at the YouTube screen my version of the answer, as in a sports event. You always scream and think you're having an impact. And I really was looking forward to this, and I'm so glad I came, and it's been delightful. And so that's the comment. My question is about the title of the book.
Ooh. Okay.
Yes, because every author knows you can't tell a book by its cover, and every literary agent knows that you can sell a book by its cover. And so when I first heard that you were coming, I was shocked, because I was wondering, well, who is this book for? Certainly it isn't for me. You're not writing a book to a black person telling us how you taught us white supremacy, because we were there. And I'm pretty old, since I was in school, and I still remember how you taught it to me. So I was wondering, who were going to be the people who you were going to teach how you taught it. And I've observed that. But the term white supremacy itself, as a historian, I can see its appeal. But as someone looking for a solution, white supremacy, especially after Nell Painter's book,
Yep.
has been so obliviated that I thought an alternative title or a better title might be Teaching Black Inferiority. Because really, that's really what you're doing. You're not talking about Chinese people. Yep. You're not talking about even Latinx people, except to the extent that they are also black. You're talking specifically about people who had a certain experience in this country, the antebellum, slavery experience, and you're continuing to perpetuate that.
Well,
Not you.
No.
But
I understand. I understand your point, but you have to keep in mind the book is actually broader than that. I do deal briefly with Native Americans. I do deal with Jewish Americans. Whiteness, in a way, doesn't know color when it comes to ideology and creation of national identity. African Americans are the largest group. But it isn't the only group that is under discussion here. After going through all those textbooks, I could easily imagine someone writing a similar book focusing entirely on Native Americans. Absolutely. So the title of the, I understand your point. But I think because a whole raft of reasons, I think since the subject matter that is being critiqued here is whiteness and its influence in shaping American national identity, and I did want to focus on that. Initially, I wanted the book to be a kind of battle, white supremacy versus a more democratic view, but there wasn't enough of a war. It was only during the post-Civil War period, Reconstruction, when there was a real serious attempt to overthrow the white supremacist foundation through textbooks and teaching. It wasn't long enough, and it was defeated by the end of the 19th century. It was just overwhelmed. But the depths of white supremacy was so deep that someone like John J. Chapman, who, I got to tell you, I spent almost a whole summer going through 50 boxes of his writings, his letters and correspondence and everything else. This was a descendant of a prominent Boston abolitionist who was himself a defender of black civil rights. Yet, the nature of white supremacy was so profound that he couldn't get off this hook of Anglo-Saxonism. He claimed at one point that he was Jewish, yet during right after the First World War, he wrote the most heinous essays damning Catholics and Jews as responsible for the attempt to take over the United States because of immigration. And at one point, he'd even described himself as Jewish. It's astonishing, but his commitment to white supremacy was even supporting African Americans, still remained with him. What happened was he started reading the garbage that Henry Ford was publishing, the Prodigals of the Elders of Zion and all that. And he became convinced that the Catholic Church was trying to take over the United States, and behind the Catholic Church were the Jews. This is an ugly, ugly legacy. And as I said before, as I was writing this section on the 1920s, I just kept saying, wait a minute, this is happening now. This fear of immigration, it's all over again. I
want to thank everybody for your thoughtful and probing questions. I want to thank Donald Iacovone for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.
And please feel free to join us in the adjacent gallery for some foods and conversation. And if you have further questions or things to talk about, let's do it over there. Thank you.